I want to bring in Dr. Michio Kaku. He's a theoretical physicist and CBS News contributor. He joins us now by phone. Dr. Kaku, what do you make of what we're seeing right now?
Well, in some sense, it's almost like a repeat of the 1985 monster earthquake that was an 8.1, a huge earthquake. And it was the anniversary, in fact, of that 1985 earthquake that killed about 10,000 people. And just remember that the Mexico area is the juncture of three major plates: the Cocos Plate, the North American Plate, and the Caribbean Plate. And these plates move about 3 inches per year, building up tremendous tension. So in some sense, it was not surprising that we had this massive unleash of energy caused by the juncture of three major plates.
You talk about this juncture of three major plates and the fault line. What can you tell us about that and the potential for these aftershocks?
Well, aftershocks are definitely a problem because, you see, Mexico City itself is based on a lake. And so parts of Mexico City are sinking. Therefore, it doesn't take much to cause buildings to fall and to ruin a very, very heavily populated area as a consequence. Now, remember that a 7.1 earthquake happens once a month someplace on the planet Earth, usually in the oceans, usually where things are not populated. But you see, this area is very sensitive because it's the juncture of three plates. And if the earthquake was near the surface of the Earth, and we're, of course, still evaluating that now, it could cause much more damage than a typical 7.1 earthquake.
Can we draw any sort of comparison, the fact that there was an earthquake in Mexico just a couple weeks ago? Any connection?
Yeah, apparently that's probably a coincidence. We're not sure. Sometimes, of course, there are aftershocks that can take place days, weeks afterwards. But right now, the indications are that they could be independent. But just remember that these earthquakes do happen in the area. In fact, there was a tsunami warning issued just 2 weeks ago because of the Chiapas earthquake that took place. And so we have to realize that that area is crisscrossed with earthquake faults. And it's not surprising that in some sense, a few decades after the 1985 earthquake, we have another massive earthquake. And we have to worry about aftershocks, as you mentioned, into the coming days.
Now, we're also getting word that there are potentially smaller quakes in California. Could there be connection with that?
Probably not, because they're separated by hundreds and hundreds of miles. However, you have to realize that it is part of the Pacific Ring of Fire. Now, the San Andreas fault, of course, does not extend all the way down to the juncture of the Cocos Plate. However, it is cause for concern. It's simply that we have to watch very carefully because, in some sense, the California earthquake could be overdue. That is, some people have calculated the cycle time for these earthquakes. This is, of course, not a precise science at all, but the cycle time indicates that a California earthquake might be overdue.
When you talk about the big one potentially hitting California, you say there's no precise science behind it. But what are your concerns as we're watching Mexico for the United States?
For the United States, I think we have to realize that this could be a dress rehearsal. That is, populations have grown tremendously over the last half century. And the consequences are going to be much more fierce than what they were like during the San Francisco earthquake 100 years ago. And so I think we have to see this as a wake-up call, that in some sense, according to one calculation, we are living on borrowed time in California, and we could be seeing a preview of what could happen because, quite frankly, we are probably not prepared for a monster 8.1 earthquake.
You say we're not prepared. What should the United States be doing? What should government officials be doing to prepare for a potential big one?
Well, you see that areas like Japan, they're some of the leaders in earthquake prevention in terms of getting an early warning system, in terms of educating young school children, in terms of getting evacuation routes, in terms of reinforcing buildings. And even then, even with all the precautions that the Japanese took, we saw the devastation caused by the Fukushima disaster, where we had a 9.1 earthquake. And however, better late than never. And so I think we should take this as a wake-up call to strengthen our building codes, emphasize education, talk to children about escape routes, get backup plans and things like this, because it's inevitable. It's only a matter of when we're going to have a big one in California.
Yeah, it's very, very scary. fact that you're mentioning right there. We just also heard from President Trump, who's at the UN General Assembly, tweeting out just a short time ago, "God bless the people of Mexico City. We are with you and we will be there for you." When you talk about the big one getting there, California in particular, is there any sort of timeline? You said that it's not a precise science, but could you put your finger on potentially if you were to guesstimate?
Yeah, it turns out that if you take a look at the San Andreas Fault, we've been able to use something called paleogeology to reconstruct the history of that fault over several centuries. And it's not precise, but we can begin to calculate the interval between major shifts of the San Andreas Fault. And according to one calculation, northern Los Angeles is perhaps the most susceptible area, and it is overdue. Now, of course, this is part black magic, part science. It's not definitive, but I think it is a wake-up call for people who are complacent and they think that nothing could be firmer than the ground under your feet. You have to realize that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when we're going to have a big one in California.
Scary probabilities that you talk about here. I want to ask you also, Dr. Kaku, about the fact that you mentioned that this has struck Mexico City. 1985, this same area had devastating consequences. Were there any lessons learned from that one that may help us today?
Yes, as a consequence of the 1985 earthquake, which was the biggest in 100 years, by the way, it meant that stricter building codes were reinforced. And just remember that back then there were a lot of shanty towns, a lot of buildings that simply collapsed. The death toll was on the order of 10,000 people died needlessly. And so I think we have a situation here where they benefited from the tightening of the building codes. My only point is that it may not be enough to prevent some people from dying. As I mentioned, the Japanese are the world's leader in terms of building skyscrapers that can bend like a leaf in the wind, and they don't topple over. But even then, we saw what happens when a tsunami and an earthquake hit northern Japan, causing casualties. 10,000 people died in the Fukushima disaster.
Yeah, can't help it. You can't ignore that fact. I want to ask you, Dr. Kaku, also about the fact that Mexico could also be facing aftershocks. What's your concern right now for the country?
Yes, I think we should prepare for aftershocks, especially in the Mexico City area, because as I mentioned, Mexico City is built on top of a lake. It is sinking. There are many historic monuments where you can actually see how far the city has sunk because it's basically sitting on top of a lake. Now, seismologists want to calculate how far below the surface of the earth the earthquake was. That's very important, because if it was a shallow earthquake, and the Richter scale number was not so high, it could still cause tremendous damage. So we want to calculate how deep this earthquake took place in order to gauge how much shaking there was actually on the surface of the earth. And from then, we could then calculate how effective our building codes were. Because as I mentioned, building codes were tightened tremendously after the 1985 earthquake.
So for people in the States, Dr. Kaku, watching this very moment right now, the aftermath of the Mexico quake from today, what's your advice to them? What should they be watching? Should they be concerned in the United States?
Definitely we should be concerned about the United States. Two areas. One is off the coast of Seattle, we have the Cascadia Fault. It is a subduction fault like Fukushima. It is capable of generating a tsunami, which could engulf the Portland-Seattle area. And, computer simulations show that the property damage would be in the billions if the Cascadia Fault were to undergo a subduction incident. Now, the San Andreas Fault is a sliding fault, so you will not get a tsunami. So that's fortunate. Many of the Hollywood movies showing the San Francisco earthquake show a gigantic tsunami. That's not going to happen because you have two plates that are sliding past each other. But still, the San Andreas Fault cuts through San Francisco and northern Los Angeles, and we see that tension is building up. By any measure, you can see that tension is building up along several segments of the San Andreas Fault, and it's only a matter of time before one of these faults begin to slip because there's so much tension building up along the fault line.
Dr. Michio Kaku, thank you so much for joining us and explaining the science behind this and the concerns for the U.S. as well. Thank you, Dr. Kaku.
My pleasure.